Well, good evening, listening audience. I am Tom Romito, your host for the evening. I'm a board member of the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. The Friends are the fundraising arm of the refuge, which, as you probably know, is Ohio's only Ohio National Wildlife Refuge and is located in the northwest part of Ohio in the western basin of Lake Erie. And our goal is to try and acquire wetlands there, to which the purpose of which is to purify water coming off of the agricultural lands, the groundwater or storm water, and purify that water before it goes into the lake. And that's important because that's our drinking water. I'm sure that you can all relate to that. Tonight, we're going to learn about unwanted and invasive plants that seem to be growing, literally and figuratively. You're here to learn more about these problematic plants and how to ID them now and throughout the year. And Carrie Brown, our presenter, is the Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator for Ohio State University Extension in Fairfield County. She's passionate about educational research and engagement, and enjoys providing research-based agricultural and natural resource programming and resources to her community and beyond. Carrie specializes in small woodland management, native plants, citizen science, and invasive species. Before I introduce Carrie, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to put in the chat room 3 links. And these 3 links will help you to get closer to the refuge virtually. One link is for our website. Another is for our events page, which will take you to future events such as this one that you can register for. And thirdly, a link is for a survey that you can take after this presentation. And by virtue of being on this presentation, you're going to receive that survey of whether you do use that link or not. So don't worry about that. But I wanted you to pay attention to it. Okay, and without further ado, I'm going to ask Carrie Brown to take the floor.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction.
You're welcome.
I'm down in Fairfield County. So I am located just southeast of Columbus. So Fairfield County is adjacent to Franklin County in Columbus. Our biggest city is Lancaster. It's our county seat. So perhaps you're familiar. We're not too far from Hocking Hills. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Feel free as we go through this to type any questions that you have in the chat. And then we will visit those questions following the presentation. All right, how does that look?
It looks great for me.
Okay, thank you. As I present, I am going to stop my video. I'm at home. I have limited bandwidth, and I think that I usually have better success if I'm not trying to present and have video at the same time. But I'll start my video again for the Q&A. So today we're going to focus on some of identification of a handful of invasive species, and then we're going to touch on some of the control methods. And in order to comprehensively cover invasive species management, in addition to identification, we'd be here all night. So at the end of this presentation, I'll provide you with a brief overview on the management of invasive species, but I'll point you towards resources that will go more in depth in controlling specific invasive species that you might have concerns with. So why Ohio? Why are we going to talk about Ohio's forests? And I know that many of you perhaps don't live in a forest or don't have a forest close to your house. I know that Tom mentioned the wetlands. Well, a lot of these species, they're invasive. They're really good at surviving different places. So as a result, they could be things that you're going to find in your own backyard, even if you aren't, living in a woodland or a forest. So many of these species can be growing in many environments. And why talk about invasive species in terms of woodlands? Well, 31% of our state is forested. So that's over 8 million acres. 86% of that, 340,000 landowners own 86% of that forest. So much of it is quite segmented and owned by a lot of different people, but collectively it's a large amount of land. Forest products industry adds $22 billion to the economy. So woodlands represent a large chunk of our state and play a large role in our economy and our ecosystems. And 60% of the 175 species of birds that nest in Ohio depend on the forest. And I have a feeling, just from where you live, that I may have a few birders in the audience. So I myself am a birder. I'm not the best birder, but I do enjoy birding. So in order for something to be considered an invasive species, there's a two-part definition. The first part is it needs to be a species that is growing outside of its native range. The second part is that it doesn't behave. It spreads rapidly into unwanted areas, and it competes with some of our native species that are contributing to the ecosystem. So I think if you look at just about any landscaping bed, you're probably going to find something that is not native. That doesn't mean it's invasive, though. In order for it to be invasive, it also has to have this tendency to spread uncontrollably. So why does this matter in terms of ecosystem functionality? Well, non-native invasive plants don't provide the same benefit to our ecosystems as natives. Our animals rely on the plants they co-evolved with. So perhaps some of you are familiar with Doug Tallamy's work in Bringing Nature Home, which was done to make this exact point. And as proof, the chart that you see here indicates the number of butterfly and moth species that rely on various genera of plants. I always say oak is king. It supports over 500 species of Lepidoptera. And in terms of herbaceous plants, goldenrod and asters lead the pack over there as far as being host plants to the greatest range of Lepidoptera species. So other than providing a huge boost to biodiversity, why else is this important? Well, any birder in the audience will be interested to know that more than 90% of our songbirds depend on these soft, wiggly packets of protein to rear their young. And it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars each season to raise just a single brood of 5 chickadees. So our native host plants offer the ultimate buffet, and that's something that non-native species simply can't provide. And that's because they didn't co-evolve with our native insects. So they're not playing host to nearly as many species as these native species are. So where did they come from? How did the invasive species get here? And there's a variety of routes. Many of them were introduced intentionally and for ornamental reasons. There were accidental introductions on barges or shipping materials or even imported plant materials. On a more localized spread, they can be transported by birds, by seeds spreading, by sticking to fur of animals like deer. So there's a lot of different ways that invasive species get introduced to new areas. Some were introduced for the best of intentions. So garlic mustard, for example, was thought to have been introduced for medicinal and culinary purposes. Many of our shrubs that we're going to talk about tonight were intentionally introduced for horticulture, landscaping. Kudzu, which is what you see in that photo there, it was introduced as a forage and for erosion control. And oftentimes these species, they stay put for many years before they develop their invasive tendencies. So they displace our native plants, they outcompete them using a variety of tactics, such as an increased growing season, meaning they leaf out before anything else, and they hold their leaves longer than other species. Some of them produce chemicals that prevent competition, and a lot of them produce just a ton of seed. So they have all of these kind of advantages over the native species. And because they're non-native and they don't have any predators that co-evolved with them here, there are few natural checks in the environment that keep them in line, so they tend to take over. So what do? They can disrupt pollinator relationships. They can reduce or eliminate, I'm not going to say just forest regeneration, but regeneration of a lot of ecosystems, a lot of habitats. They can compete with existing stands for nutrients and water, and they can reduce and eliminate understory plants. So within a woodland, the understory really takes a hard hit. And this is what our native understory can look like. But with the introduction of invasive species, that understory can get pushed out. Those native wildflowers, those native fungi can get displaced in a situation like what you see here, because they simply can't compete with the advantages that these native species have. So this is an example how invasives can impact native ecosystems. Just a couple of examples. Japanese barberry and ticks. So we'll take a deeper dive on Japanese barberry, but it was introduced in the mid-1800s, and it has the ability to crowd out native plants and create these really dense thickets. These thickets create a humid environment that's perfect for harboring rodents. So we have an increased population of barberry harboring an increased population of rodents. These rodents harbor an increased population of ticks, many of which may be deer ticks, which are the type of ticks that are probably you're going to find out this time of year. In fact, I found one today on my dog. And that's the species of ticks that transmits Lyme disease. So you can kind of see it's a little bit of a domino effect here. And ultimately, this is something that impacts human health. I wanted to throw this one in also, just because I think it's interesting, and I love birds. So in the bird world, brilliant red males are seen as a sign of high quality mate. And in urban environments, birds such as cardinals often have diets that are rich in things like honeysuckle and multiflora rose, neither of which are very high in nutrients, but they do create that bright red color within those male birds. So even though those male birds have this brilliant red feather, and they're going to increase the number of mates they're able to attract, in this case, that red color is not indicative of a healthy mate in actuality, because they aren't eating the food that is going to have higher amounts of nutrient when there's just a ton of honeysuckle berries and multiflora rose hips available to them. So it can really mess with an ecosystem in many ways. And this is our newest pair that we're really talking about, and I have a feeling you're familiar with it up there. This is spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. So this is an interesting story because both of these came from the same place. Tree of heaven, we'll talk more about. It's been here for many, many years, centuries, in fact. Whereas the spotted lanternfly came pretty recently, and they're from the same part of Asia. So now that they have both found their way over here, it makes sense that they have found each other once again, because this is actually a natural host plant of the spotted lanternfly. Unfortunately, it's not the only thing a spotted lanternfly will eat, which is what makes spotted lanternfly is such a problem. It'll also feed on wild and cultivated grapes, fruit trees, and really a whole host of number of different species. But spotted or tree of heaven is one of its main preferences. So which plants are regulated as invasive in Ohio? And here's the list. We're going to talk about a handful of them tonight. The list continues on. There's a few of them in here that we're not going to, actually quite a few of them we're not going to get to, but I tried to pick some of the ones that I feel is most prevalent throughout the state. Before we get into the identification, I did want to mention this because this is a really nice resource, and maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's been around since 2018, I believe. And one of the issues with invasive species is the amount of time it takes to add newly introduced species to watch lists or control lists. And by the time this is accomplished, the situation has often turned from preventative to reactive. So this publication aims to provide a heads up on what may be up and coming. And the purpose of the guide is to help landowners and land managers recognize plants with invasive tendencies that are not yet widely distributed and may not be on an invasive plant list yet, but that way they can be treated rapidly and hopefully eradicated rather than becoming a large and expensive problem like many of the species we're going to talk about tonight. And I can, after I am done presenting, I can drop a link to this in the chat. It is just a PDF. And I really like this passage. It's in the introduction of this field guide. It states that not all newly introduced species become invasive. Those which do often follow an invasive pattern. They remain at low levels for several years or even decades. I read on average the lag phase can be about 50 years, and then they enter a phase where they increase dramatically. So attempting to control large invasive plant infestations, of course, is a costly endeavor, and it can be much more effective to allocate resources towards invasive plant prevention or the rapid treatment of new introductions. So that's really the purpose of this guide, is to kind of get a heads up or a head start on some of these species that are demonstrating some invasive tendencies. Here is a table of contents. You're going to recognize a lot of these plants. I see Coosa dogwood on there, paper mulberry, daffodils, butterfly bush. It's important to note that not all species included will be problematic in all portions of the region because this guide covers a 20-state area. It just means that it has escaped cultivation at some part of the northeast and north central region. So a great guide to look at. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this list, but this just kind of gives you an idea of how they built that guide. So they were looking for different characteristics of plants at different watch lists, and that's how they chose the species that were included. So on to the main event, the plants that are already known to be causing widespread issues. And before we go through the identification of these species, I always like to preface this, that plants, these plants that we're going to talk about, they're simply doing what plants do. So they're simply thriving, but they happen to be where they don't belong. And really this applies to all invasive species, whether it's a plant or an animal. And I know I've seen some presentations that villainize these species, such as the photo that you see here. I actually stole this from a different presentation, which of course stole it from a movie. And I think while it adds a bit of humor to the presentation, it's also important to step back and realize that these species are not inherently bad. They just don't belong in the ecosystems that they've escaped into. And in many cases, it's our fault as humans that they're here in the first place. So this is a point that I think is especially to point out when communicating with children. So I do quite a bit of outreach into schools, especially with spotted lanternfly awareness. And I'm always careful in how I depict invasive species. I think demonizing nature, even if we are talking about harmful invasive species, just isn't helpful when promoting connections to the outdoors. So, the goal rather is to promote an understanding and awareness. So I've divided the presentation into vines, shrubs, herbaceous species, and trees, and we are going to start with those that creep and are often out of sight until they flower, and that are our vines. So Japanese honeysuckle is a semi-evergreen or semi-evergreen, depending on where you are. I know down in my part of the state, this had never lost its leaves this year. We've had a rather warm winter since December, and they have stayed evergreen. But I know in some parts of the state, they do go dormant and lose their leaves. When they're young, the stems are hairy, and as they grow older, they lose that hair and those stems will thicken. The leaves are opposite of one another. They're oval in shape. Usually their margins are entire, but when these plants are young, they can have margins that are quite lobed. So there can be some variation in the leaf shape. They flower typically from April to July. I say typically because I took a photo of some flowering Japanese honeysuckle last October 29th. So this is something that really is able to flower and produce fruit all season long. And speaking of fruit, there's those black globular fruits. They start out green, they turn to black when ripened, and those flowers are very fragrant. So some people refer to this plant as old-fashioned honeysuckle, and I have had many folks refuse to believe that the honeysuckle they grew up with was an invasive honeysuckle. It's possible they had a native, but more than likely, this is what people remember because it smells amazing. The smell of Japanese honeysuckle reminds me of my grandma because she had this vine climbing the side of her house. So I think that, a lot of times good smells, they kind of bring back those memories. And I think this is one of them. So this is, likely what you are remembering if you're thinking of old-fashioned honeysuckle, because there are other honeysuckles we're going to touch on today. So it can overtake some really large areas. It can have a really big impact on ecosystems. And you can see this is Japanese honeysuckle up in a northern part of Ohio that completely lost its leaves during the wintertime. Excuse me. Whereas down here, it tends to hold on to its leaves. So next up is what has been known by some as the plant that ate the South, and this is kudzu. This is a woody perennial vine. It has compound leaves with 3 leaflets, just like soybeans. The leaves themselves look similar to soybeans. They are alternate on the stem. The leaflets may be entire or they may be slightly lobed and hairy. They have these really good looking flowers. That's the thing about these invasives. A lot of them are good looking plants, and this is one of them. They're fragrant, they hang in clusters, and this is a legume. So those flowers will develop into pods, hairy pods that you see there on the right. Those tend to be flattened and also kind of resemble something you might find on a soybean plant or another legume. The plant can grow up to 60 feet a year. So, I mean, that's incredible. I think you could probably pull up a chair and watch it grow. So definitely has some invasive tendencies, I would say. You can see that it is able to really take over some large areas. This is St. Clairsville, so this is the eastern part of the state. Excuse me, sorry. It was first introduced in 1876 as a forage plant, and it was used also for erosion control. It was widely planted until the mid-50s, in which time it was removed from USDA's permissible cover crop list. But at that time, it already had its foothold in many areas, which is something that we continue to deal with today. So a couple more pictures. You can see on that top picture that some of these leaves are entire, while some of them have those lobes. There is quite a bit of variation in what those leaves look like, but they are going to have 3 lobes. Oftentimes we get the question, is it in Ohio? And it certainly is. So you can see those really large populations, St. Clairsville, Cleveland. We have it climbing a house in Cleveland. And then down in Cincinnati, we have it overtaken an area. So, as we get those more mild winters, then this isn't killing off. It's not killing off. It has a longer growing season. So I think this is a plant that we're going to continue to see creeping farther and farther north. So next up is Oriental Bittersweet, and this is a woody vine that, from my experience in the woodlands, it can be a tricky invasive to eradicate because it's a really good creeper and it can kind of hide in plain sight, especially if it's not fruiting and flowering. It prefers sun to part shade, but I've seen it in the densest of shade. Some call it the kudzu of the north because it's able to overtake areas similar to kudzu. It has these yellow fruits that split open in the fall to reveal these bright red-orange seeds. Oftentimes you see these used in Christmas wreaths or other Christmas decorations. I've seen them in grave blankets as well. The danger with that is those seeds can stay viable for over a decade. So if you dispose of that Christmas wreath, you may be introducing that plant into wherever it is you are putting your wreath or composting your wreath. Those vines can climb very high, and it displaces a native bittersweet that we have here in the state. It can also hybridize with that American bittersweet and create something that is nearly as invasive as the Oriental bittersweet. If you're wondering if the bittersweet that perhaps you have is Oriental or American bittersweet, there are some characteristics to tell them apart. Oriental fruit, the fruit in Oriental bittersweet is going to be found in clusters along the entire stem, whereas the American bittersweet is going to produce clusters of berries at the tip of the branch, so beyond those leaves. Excuse me. But in any case, those two plants, those two species are able to hybridize and produce something that has what we call hybrid vigor, which means that it has some of those same properties that make invasive plants invasive. And you can see that woody vine has the ability to outcompete and in some cases strangle other vines and trees in its proximity. So next up is a vine that stays green all winter long, no matter where you are, and that is winter creeper. So this is an evergreen perennial vine. It was introduced as a ground cover. It does its job as far as ground covers go. The problem is it doesn't stay where you put it. It can tolerate broad range of environmental conditions, from full sun to deep shade, and I think that's probably part of what made it so attractive for ornamental use. It was able to grow, in shady areas and areas that had pollution and urban areas. It has these leaves that are really glossy, dark green. They're slightly toothed, oppositely arranged, and it's a euonymus. So that means it's in the same genus as burning bush, which we'll talk about momentarily. So when it finds something to climb, it will flower, and then it will produce these fruits that look a lot like something from that last slide with the Oriental bittersweet. So it can look quite different from if it's creeping on the ground or if it's climbing up a tree. You can see those leaves have really increased in size as it climbs that tree. So next up are herbaceous plants. The first one is called lesser celandine, also known as fig buttercup. So this, as you might guess by its good looks, was introduced as an ornamental plant. It is herbaceous, meaning it dies back at the end of the year. It forms these low-growing mats, and it spreads primarily through vegetative means. So even though we have all those flowers, it produces these tubers and bulbets that are spread by animals, by well-meaning weed pullers like you and me, perhaps, and especially flood events. It's found in moist soils to forested floodplains, low open woods, meadows, and roadsides. This can be a tough one to eradicate just because of how quickly large populations can pop up from this plant. And really, if it's not flowering, it's not something that you may be paying a lot of attention to. So next up is Japanese stiltgrass, and this is really more of a woodland thing. It's thought to have been introduced in 1919 as a packing material for porcelain. It's kind of an interesting introduction story. It grows up to 3 feet, but it can also grow really low, kind of almost like turf, if it's in a real shaded area. Oftentimes you find this along hiking trails because it is spread by people and by deer. It has this purplish hue in the fall, and its leaves, it's a grass. So it has these lance-shaped, thin, pale green color in the growing season, and then it gets this dark red color. This one can be difficult to control just because timing is very critical. So if you allow this go to flower and seed, and then you decide to go through and mow it, well, you've just created a bigger mess for yourself because you've spread that seed. So those grasses can definitely be tricky to get rid of. So next one up is Japanese knotweed. This definitely looks more like a shrub just by its size, but this is an herbaceous plant. It's one, I'm going to be honest, that truly scares me. I'm only aware of a few patches within my county, but large populations are established throughout Ohio. So it's one to be on the lookout for. I was in Pittsburgh this past fall for a spotted lanternfly study tour, and I was amazed how this plant dominated the edge of roadways within the city of Pittsburgh, and it was even outcompeting bush honeysuckle, which is an aggressive shrub that we're going to talk about in a bit. So it packs a big punch. It actually spreads vegetatively by rhizomes. These are fragments of root. If you were to go through, for instance, and till an area that has Japanese knotweed, you would regret it, because if you till those rhizomes, each one of those rhizomes is a clone of that parent, and it's able to grow roots and produce another plant. So that's why this can be a tricky plant to get rid of. It's able to hybrid with other species of knotweeds. Some of the populations produce fertile seeds, but generally this is spreading vegetatively. It can grow up to 10 feet in height. So this can be a very big plant. And as far as herbaceous plants go that die back at the end of the year, this is, I think, something that's interesting. You typically, if you were to look at this, you would think it is a shrub that, is going to just leaf back out the next year, but that's not the case. So it has these simple alternate leaves that can be 6 inches long. They taper at the tip, has a deep taproot, hollow stalks, kind of like bamboo. It has these small creamy white flowers arranged in spikes that bloom from August to September and produce these really interesting fruit that are winged in order to use wind and water to spread. It's semi-shade tolerant to full sun, and it does just fine in wet conditions. So this is an up-close picture of the stem. You can kind of see the resemblance to bamboo. Here it is at the end of this season. So it's losing its leaves, and it's actually going to come up on new stalks, kind of like what asparagus looks like. Here's the flowers, and then there's those winged fruit. So those single-seeded fruit that are produced from those flowers at the end of the season. So if you have a woodland of any size, you're likely intimately familiar with this plant. Garlic mustard was introduced into North America for medicinal purposes and food in mid-1800s. It is a biennial, which means that its first year of its life, it is growing as a rosette. So it's growing low to the ground. It's building up a big chunky root system, kind of like a carrot. A carrot is also a biennial. And then the next year it uses the energy and that big chunky root, that big tap root, to shoot up the stem with these flowers and produce a large amount of seeds. Just like its name indicates, it is in the mustard family, and it's known to have allelopathic properties that inhibit the growth of other plants around it, including plants, but also species that have symbiotic relationships with soil fungi. And it can just overtake large areas. One thing to mention about this plant is, I feel like this time of year you start seeing events for like garlic mustard polls. So what you see in the top picture, that big cluster of flowering plants, if I were to pull all of those as they are right now and place them in a pile, and when I pull them, if I get their root, because oftentimes they're pretty easy to pull, a lot of times you're able to get, that root system when you pull it, and I were to put those in a pile, well, there's a good chance that they would go on to mature and produce seed because of that energy that's stored in its root. It doesn't have to be planted anymore to do that once it gets to a certain point. So because of that, it's important to think about where you put this if you do pull it. Some different things that you could do. You can bag it and landfill it. But another method, especially with these larger areas, is if you use hedge trimmers and you go in there and you just cut this at multiple levels. So just kind of go through multiple times and just snip it, lower and lower to the ground. That's going to prevent those flowers from maturing into producing seed. It may come back and flower again. It depends on where you are in the season, but that is another option. On to shrubs. So we are going to start with another honeysuckle, and this is bush honeysuckle. So there are multiple species of bush honeysuckle that you see out there, but all of them invade forest edges. They really take advantage of natural gaps within the canopy. There you'll also find them in right-of-ways and fence row invaders. And they can make a really large impact where they grow. As far as what they look like, you can see these are the four main species that you're going to see. Most of the time you're going to see Morrow honeysuckle or Amur honeysuckle. Both of them have like these white or creamy white flowers. Tartarian honeysuckle has those deep red. I honestly have never seen Tartarian honeysuckle myself, but I have seen the bells or showy fly honeysuckle, which is that pretty pink color on the right. That's actually a hybrid between Tartarian and Morrow honeysuckle. But regardless of which variety or which species it is, they all cause the same issues. These species leaf out very early. In fact, in my area, I saw leaf buds breaking last week. So they are already, I already see green on the tips of these shrubs. And we're only at the beginning of March. They're also one of the last plants to lose their leaves in the fall. So they really use that extended growing season as one of their advantages. The flowers in bush honeysuckle typically are not largely fragrant, but they do develop these small red multi-seeded fruit that are consumed and eaten and spread by birds. So another understory invader is autumn olive. This was introduced from Asia around 1830 and was used not only for ornamental reasons, but also for strip mine reclamation. So this is a plant that produces its own nitrogen. It's not a legume, but it produces its own nitrogen, and it is able to grow in the poorest of soils. So that made it really great for strip mine reclamation that has very little topsoil. But it turns out that this is a forest invader. It will also target those natural forest gaps in the canopy and in harvested areas. You're also going to find it along the road and in fence rows as well. It can grow 20 feet tall, maybe bigger, and it has these egg-shaped leaves that are 1 to 3 inches long. And they're really kind of known for their glistening effect because the back of these leaves are white. They have these glistening scales. And if you can see, the fruit that you see there also has some glistening scales to it as well. So does the stem. So the entire plant, especially if the wind's blowing and the sun's shining, you really can see this from a distance just because of that glistening effect. So next up is one of my least favorites because it's something I deal with a lot in my woodland, and it's armed, and that's multiflora rose. So this was originally introduced intentionally as rootstock for ornamental roses. And it also made a really great living fence because it's able to create these really large thickets that livestock don't want to pass through, and I don't blame them. They're able to spread through seed, through root sprouting, and through layering. Layering occurs when a cane comes in contact with the soil, produces root, and then becomes a functionally independent plant from the parent plant. And it thrives on poor growing sites. So it prefers full sun, but it does just fine in the shade of a mature forest. It should be noted that it is susceptible to rosette disease, which is a good thing in this case because it's something to help control its spread, but it continues to spread regardless of that. I found this. It's from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's a publication from the 1940s and 50s. So this is another example of good intentions with bad results. And you might say, what were they thinking? Well, part of what they were thinking is that these plants, they're hardy, they're disease-free, they didn't have pest issues, and they reproduce easily. So, on the surface level, that sounds pretty good. But these same characteristics, they turned out to make this competitive with native plants. So, we always say hindsight's 20/20. So remember that most of these species didn't act badly in their native ranges where they were collected. And that's because they had established enemies that kept it under control there. So like most invasive plants, it doesn't act the same way here as it did where it was from. So it's important to, even though we see these publications and it can be frustrating, we also need to kind of give history a little bit of grace. So small white roses are fragrant. They develop into small rose hips that tend to be smaller than the rose hips of our native rose species. And like I said, it is susceptible to rosette disease, which is what you see in the bottom picture there. It's also called witch's broom. It's a viral infection that's spread by mites, and it affects the growing tips and results in this stunted, non-functional growth. It also often has this vibrant red color to it. So the best way to tell multiflora rose apart from native species is by looking at a structure near the base of the prickle or the base of a leaf, and that is called the stipule. So the stipule is what you see here right above the prickle. It's fringed when it comes to multiflora rose. So you can kind of see those little fringes. This identification tip comes in handy, especially if the plant is flowerless and fruitless. Multiflora rose is the only species that I know of that's going to have these fringed stipules. And really, if you have a plant, these are really, they're small, but they are pretty easy to see. So next on the list is barberry. So this is a plant that is widely cultivated. It comes in an assortment of colors and sizes. It's more than likely found in a McDonald's or doctor's office landscape near you. But the problem is that many of these cultivars are still able to fruit heavily. And when that seed is distributed into natural areas, they can revert back to their original green color and create issues in the understory. Like I said earlier in the presentation, they provide shelter for mice and can increase the population of deer ticks, in turn increasing the amount of Lyme disease. It was introduced in the 1800s as an ornamental, and it was actually used to replace common barberry, which is on the invasive species list, because there was a problem with common barberry being an alternate host for a disease that was affecting our cultivated grains. Japanese barberry, it's a medium shrub. Like you saw in those pictures, it's been cultivated, a million different ways. It is armed, so it does have these needle-like spines, and it can produce small thickets that can quickly become into walls that are dangerous to walk through. And like we said earlier, they provide shelter for mice and can increase that population of deer ticks. Winged burning bush. So this is what is likely the most ubiquitous shrub in terms of landscaping. It was introduced as an ornamental in 1860. It's multi-stemmed, has this nice shrubby shape up to 20 feet high. The leaves are deciduous, but before they drop those leaves in the fall, they turn this brilliant red-purple color. And despite its invasive nature, it remains to be a very popular plant. It's known for its bright red color that you see there, and I like this photo because it shows you the wings that you see on that stem. And though in a perfect world, it would stay put, in reality, that's not what happens. It's, this time of year and that you see in this photo, so in the fall, it really sticks out like a sore thumb. Everything else is losing its leaves, whereas this is, really putting on a show. So this shows, that doesn't stay put, and it can really have an impact, especially on wood edges. Privet is another one that has been around for quite a while. It was introduced as a hedge. It's multi-stemmed. It can grow up to 20 feet high. I see this a lot in southern parts of Ohio, but I'm sure it's all around. It has these flower clusters that develop into small black berries that persist into the winter time. And there are multiple privet species that have invasive properties. And here's some pictures of the flowers, and then the dark berries that those will eventually develop into. And last but not least, we're going to look at a few trees. The first one is Ailanthus, also known as Tree of Heaven. Luckily, this is on the invasive species list. It has been for quite a while. You're not going to find it at a landscape store near you, but it probably is growing in a railroad or tree line near you. This is a very prevalent invasive species. It can grow up to 80 feet in height. It produces allelopathic chemicals in multiple parts of the plant, but especially its root system, and that is to prevent competition to keep things from growing around it. It has these pinnately compound alternate leaves, so that means that we have an entire leaf is made up of, I think, up to 31 leaflets. I'll have a better picture here on the next slide, because each of those leaflets can have a glandular tooth at the base. And that's one of the identifying characteristics of this plant, because it can be easy to mix up with black walnut, sumac, or hickory, some of our native trees that have these pinnately compound leaves. It has large terminal flower clusters that are yellowish green. They're not very showy in April through June. And then they turn into this winged fruit, which is what you see here. They're born in clusters. They have this rosy color, and eventually they will dry and turn to brown, and the tree will hold on to those all winter long and kind of distribute them as the wind blows. A female tree can produce more than 300,000 seeds. So as far as invasive properties go, Tree of Heaven has a lot of those going for it. Here's a few pictures. You can see its bark in the bottom right corner is gray, and it stays relatively smooth even as it ages. So that's a good identifying characteristics to tell this apart from, say, a black walnut that's going to have darker, much more rigid bark than the Ailanthus or the Tree of Heaven. And then you can also see the glandular teeth that I have circled in yellow. Those are at the base of the leaflet. They are more prominent on some leaflets than others. And then one other thing I didn't put on this slide is if you crush the leaf of this plant, it smells like peanut butter. Some people call it rancid peanut butter. It's not the best smell. So it's been here for a long time. If you've ever read the book, A Tree That Grows in Brooklyn, this is the tree. This is the tree that book is talking about, because it will literally grow through a crack in a sidewalk. It was used in landscape. It was widely planted as a street tree, but it had a lot of impacts. So it's able to invade forest edges, natural forest gaps, harvested areas, but really anywhere else. You find this right in the middle of a city because it requires very little space. I've seen this growing out of grates before, in between a sidewalk and a building. It's able to really just, it's very adaptable. Something to be aware of with this plant is that it should be handled with care, especially if you have broken skin. So exposure to sap through broken skin can result in inflammation of the heart muscle. And you can see the range of symptoms there, but definitely something to keep in mind if you are handling Tree of Heaven. Buckthorns. So buckthorns can grow up to 20 feet. Oftentimes you find them in these large thickets, and if you cut their stems, it reveals this yellow sapwood. Sometimes it kind of can have a pinkish or an oranges hue, and you can see the thorn there in the picture next to it. That's, it gets its name honestly, as it is well armed. And there's two that we really deal with. Common buckweed is mainly uplands, open woods, woodland edges, prairies, open fields, and it has this wavy leaf margin. Whereas glossy buckthorn, which I'm guessing is you're going to find more where you are, prefers wet soils, so bogs, swamps, wet meadows. But it can tolerate uplands. It has smooth leaf edges. And in both cases, the leaves can persist into the late fall. And it can be a hard one to handle because of those thorns. So next up is Callery pear. So this is a tree that was declared invasive in the state of Ohio 5 years ago. However, when it was put on the list, nurseries were given 5 years to sell their stock. So they actually didn't become illegal to sell until January of 2023, so very recently. So at this point, this is not a plant you should see at any of your nurseries because they cannot legally sell it anymore. So Callery pear, you've all, I'm sure, seen a Callery pear. You can go through subdivisions and everyone has one right in their front yard. And you can tell the age of the subdivision based on how many of the trees have broken at the crotch, because these tend to have weaknesses in those crotch areas, and you might lose a quarter of a tree, a half of a tree, 3/4 of a tree if you get a big wind gust. So the leaves are alternate, simple, and toothed. It is in the rose family, so it is going to have some similarities to other fruit trees. You have those white flowers in the early spring. They develop into small fruits, small hard fruits that are spread by birds and other wildlife that eat the fruit. I tend to see birds avoiding this until they're really hungry. I think probably like February, that time of year when they're starting to get short on food, you might see them, go through neighborhoods with Callery pear and clean those trees out. But I don't know that it's a favorite. And originally these were thought to be sterile, but the problem is that different genotypes, so let's say I have cultivar A, well, cultivar A cannot cross with, or cannot produce fruit with another cultivar A. But the problem is there's also cultivar B, and it turns out that cultivar A can produce fruit with cultivar B. So it turns out they weren't sterile, it didn't stay that way. And they're able to cross-pollinate and produce fruit that has viable seed. So just quickly to touch on control methods, there are a variety of them out there. Mechanical might be one of them that you choose. So this might be like mow management using a weed eater. And when it comes to mechanical, timing is critical because you're trying to prevent the spread. So whether you're dealing with something that you're keeping an eye on because you want to cut it back before it actually produces fruit, or if it's better to remove it, for instance, when it's dormant, or just plain easier to remove it when it's dormant, because then you don't have all that leaf matter to deal with. So timing is critical with mechanical methods. There are a variety of colorful tools out there that can help you grub these out if you have the strength, and drive to do so. They have colorful names as well. We have the polar bear, the weed wrench, the extractigator, and of course the honeysuckle popper. On the list, the honeysuckle popper is the only one I have personal experience with, but there's a lot of options out there. If you are dealing with a larger infestation, then you can clear mechanically, or if perhaps you're in an area that just suits herbicide application better, foliar spray might be something that you choose. So this, of course, is important to use when plants are leafed out. And it can be especially useful if you're encompassing large areas. It's really important to, we always say label is the law, and read those labels, because that label is going to specify a lot of information as far as the environmental conditions needed for spraying, the rate, the amount, the time of year. All of that information is on the label, and it is controlled by the law. So if you go against the label, you are breaking the law. With a lot of these, you're going to want to use a surfactant. And that's just a additive to your mix that's going to help the chemical adhere to the leaves. So it's going to give you a better coverage, better kill, hopefully less reapplication. Of course, it's important to spray this when the vegetation is actively growing, because the goal is for that vegetation to pull this down into the roots so that you can get a full kill on the plant. Spray the entire canopy, but not to run off unless the label dictates, and spray when a rain event is more than 6 hours off. Typically, the label will tell you how long drying time is. So follow that label and make applications from early summer to late September, and it's going to depend on the herbicide. So once again, take a look at the label. For some sites, you could use a combination of mechanical and foliar application. So it may be, easier to go in there and, cut down these areas and then come back and do a foliar application. By doing that, you're probably not going to have to use quite as much herbicide, and it may be easier for you to avoid killing off-target plants. In the picture here is bush honeysuckle. I don't want to say the nice thing about bush honeysuckle, but one thing that we can take advantage of with bush honeysuckle is its early leafing out, and the fact that it loses its leaves late. So when this plant is leafing out, most everything else is still dormant. It's still sleeping for the winter. So that's one of the characteristics that we can almost use against this plant when we're thinking about control. To be even more on target, you can use basil bark spray. So this works really well with barks that are relatively smooth and no more than, I'd say 6 inches in diameter. Typically, this is with smaller trees or shrubs, and you're going to spray the lower 12 to 18 inches. And you use an additive to the herbicide that you're using that allows that to absorb into the bark and then down into the root system. So you don't get an instant kill with basil bark spray. It may take some time for the tree to die, but by using this method, you're not, spraying herbicide over a large area. So you can be more selective with where you're spraying. Same with hack and squirt or an injection system. So kind of same thought behind this, other than you're actually wounding the tree and then injecting or squirting the herbicide right into those wounds. So another thing that is going to prevent off-target herbicide application, but will take the tree a little bit of time to die. And then there's cut stump. So this is removing the tree, so cutting the tree and then painting the stump with an herbicide. There are water-soluble herbicides such as glyphosate that you can use to paint a fresh cut. So this is like you just cut it, you can paint it with that herbicide. If you want to go through and clear an area and then come back and paint multiple stumps, then you're more than likely going to want to use something that's oil soluble like Garlon 4. That's going to have a little bit more forgiveness time, I guess. And you're able to go back and paint those stumps. And because it has that oil soluble solution to it, then it's able to penetrate even if it's not a real fresh cut. But really the number one control method is prevention. So try to keep those from spreading in the first place. And, there's many different things that you can do to do that. I'm sure that you have seen all of these. You've probably seen pictures and posters and signs at nature preserves. But that's just really it all comes down to vigilance. So prior to relocating equipment, make sure that it's clear of any seeds that you may have picked up along the way. No matter if you're riding through a wetland or a woodland or a roadside or a road right away, those are all areas that, could have or probably have invasive species that could cling on to whatever it is you're trekking with. So kind of be vigilant, rinse those off before you introduce those into a new area. Removing soil, seeds, and debris from your shoes, from your clothing, and properly treating or disposing of invasive species. So some of these things, they're not going to do well in a compost pile. Well, they'll do well from their perspective because they're just going to continue to grow. So kind of think about the best way to deal with some of these if you are especially mechanically removing them. I did want to note quickly before we get to Q&A that I'm going to be speaking next Friday, March 10th at 10 a.m. on our native spring wildflowers. And I just wanted to mention this because these are the exact species that oftentimes we're striving to preserve when we remove invasive species, many of which that we were talking about. And this is a free Zoom program. You can register at go.osu.edu/springflowers. And you can explore these springtime beauties from the comfort of your couch. And this program will also be recorded. So from there, my contact information is on the screen, brown.2766@osu.edu. And I also have the website of the Woodland Stewards program, which is part of OSU. We have a lot of fact sheets. We have lots of webinars and videos on there that can help you combat your invasive species on your property. So if you, for instance, you really are dealing with bush honeysuckle, well, we have a fact sheet on there that will suggest specific chemicals for you, and that can be really useful depending on what it is that you're dealing with. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can take a look at the chat.
Well, thank you very much,
All right,
Carrie, for sharing all of that. You do have a couple of questions in the chat room. You want to pick them up yourself?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. So Tom, can I tell you how many invasive plants are found in Ohio? Well, to be honest, I haven't counted that list.
Okay.
But the list that I put up is inclusive as far as what have officially been deemed as invasive. So the list does continue to grow as new plants are assessed, new species are assessed. I don't know that any species leave the list, not that I know of at least. I think once they're on the list, they're on the list, but there are new species that are added occasionally also.
Can you give us a number to the nearest 100?
We'll say 50. It's probably more than that.
Okay, real fine. Well, thank you.
All right. Margie asks, what is the best way to rid or kill tree of heaven? Margie, that is a tough one because this is a plant that, hi there, that is able to really thrive in many conditions. And if you kill it the wrong way, then you're just going to tick it off. And it's going to come back and send up root shoots within 50 feet of that parent tree. So if anybody has ever just cut a tree of heaven down and walked away, you've probably experienced this. The old saying is, if you cut down a tree of heaven, 100 will come to its funeral. And that's because of its ability to kind of fight back by sending up root sprouts. So with that being said, the best way to kill tree of heaven, and it really depends on where you are, but if you're in an area where you are able to kill it slowly using one of those methods like basil bark or hack and squirt, that's going to be your best bet because your goal is for it not to realize it's dying. It still probably will send up some root shoots, but not nearly as much as if you were to just cut it down. If you're in an area like next to a driveway, for instance, that's probably not going to be your best bet because you don't want, this tree to die slowly and come down on your car. So in that case, you might just have to bite the bullet and just cut it down. Just be prepared to deal with those root sprouts And that can be done just by using a cut stump method. You could just cut each of those individually and then paint those tiny little stumps. So it does take some work, but it can be done. Thank you for that question. All right. And from there, so Frank says, I see staghorn sumac at the side of interstates that seem to be taking over swaths. Is it invasive? You showed a 6-inch trunk that looks like sassafras, which can grow and grows. Is it invasive? Well, by definition, they're not invasive because they're native species. But that doesn't mean that native species can't have invasive tendencies. For instance, one that always comes up is grapevine, wild grapevine. Grapevine, especially in really large area or in large populations, can do a lot of damage to trees. And because we've segmented our forest into all these small parcels, it's all edge habitat. And grapevine loves edge habitat, and so does staghorn sumac and sassafras. So some of these species that love edge habitat do have those tendencies to have those invasive properties. So if they're causing an issue, they might be something that need to be removed. But given the right space, they're not doing any harm to the ecosystem. So they're still a native species. They're still a host plant for something or many somethings. And they are contributing in a way that true invasive species do not contribute, because they don't belong here and they don't host our native insects. That's a really great question. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening.
Well, it was our pleasure to be your audience, Carrie. Thank you, audience, for being here. All 23 of you hung in there the whole time, and I'm proud of you for doing that. Please take a look at the websites I gave you. Learn more about Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge and our upcoming virtual education programs such as this. And don't forget to take our survey and let us know how we're doing, what you'd like to see and hear about natural science. So I'll let you go all now and have a great week, and good night.
All right. Thank you. See you all later. I hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.